The bank's letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of April morning in Harlan County where the fog sits low in the hollows and doesn't burn off until nearly noon. Nora Whitfield found it between a seed catalog and a water bill plain white envelope with a red stamp in the upper left corner that she had learned to recognize from 30 feet away. She stood at the mailbox for a moment, the gravel drive stretching behind her toward the farmhouse, the orchard rising on the hillside above it. And she opened the letter right there without going inside. 90 days, $94,000. Final notice. She folded the letter, once put it in her jacket pocket, and walked back up the drive. Inside, she set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it, the way you look at something you have been expecting and dreading in equal measure for a very long time. The kitchen smelled of coffee and old wood. Through the window above the sink, the first rows of cherry trees were barely visible through the morning fog, just the dark shapes of trunks and the beginning of new leaves, pale green against gray. She had stood at that window for 5 years, watching seasons move through those trees. She was 58 years old, and she had not expected this to be the hardest thing she ever did. She had been wrong about that. She poured coffee she did not drink and sat down at the table and read the letter again. 90 days. The orchard covered 340 acres on a hillside that her grandfather Walter Whitfield had purchased in the spring of 1961 when he was 33 years old and had almost nothing to his name but a strong back and a particular stubbornness that the people of Harlan County had long since stopped trying to argue with. He had planted the first trees himself, hauling saplings in the bed of a borrowed truck, setting each one by hand in soil he had turned himself. Nearly 1,500 cherry trees, old variety plantings, that no commercial nursery had bothered with for decades, chosen for reasons Walter never fully explained to anyone except himself, and possibly to Dottie Crane next door, who had known him longer than anyone still living. The trees produced fruit that was smaller than the premium grade categories favored by modern distributors. Not tiny, just smaller. What they lacked in size, they made up for in something harder to measure and easier to taste. The cherries were intensely sweet, layered in flavor with an aromatic richness that made them memorable in a way that larger, more uniform fruit rarely was. Customers at the farmers market in town came back every July without being reminded. Chefs called ahead to reserve quantities. Families who found the orchard once returned for years. None of that translated into the margins that kept a working farm alive. 5 years ago, when Walter died and left the property to Nora, she had come home from her teaching position in Louisville and walked every row of the orchard in a single afternoon and decided she was not going to cut the trees down. She had not made that decision out of sentiment alone, though sentiment was part of it. She had made it because she believed there was a market she had not found, yet a buyer who would understand what the trees were actually producing. She had been looking ever since, and now she had 90 days. Dottie arrived at 7:30 as she did every Monday, coming through the gap in the fence line that the two properties shared, carrying a covered dish and a thermos of coffee. She was 68 years old and moved like someone who had been doing physical work her entire life and saw no reason to slow down about it. She knocked once on the back door and came in without waiting. She saw the letter on the table immediately. She set her things down, poured herself a cup from the thermos, and sat across from Nora without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "How bad?" Nora told her the number. Dottie was quiet. She looked at the table and then out the window toward the orchard and then back at her coffee. She did not offer reassurances because she was not that kind of woman, and Nora had never wanted that kind of woman for a neighbor. "I have to find a buyer," Nora said. "A real one, not the co-op." Dottie nodded slowly. "You've been saying that for 5 years. I know it. The difference now being 90 days. Yes." They sat with that for a while. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, and the upper rows of the orchard were coming into light, the new leaves catching the morning in a way that made the hillside look almost luminous. Nora had seen that sight hundreds of times, and it still did something to her that she could not quite explain to anyone who had not grown up looking at it. Ben Garner arrived at 8 and came through the barn to check on the irrigation system, which had been running unevenly along the north block since the previous week. He was 38 years old and had been working the Whitfield property for 12 years, first under Walter and then under Nora, and he knew the land with the particular intimacy of someone who had walked it in every season and every kind of weather. He was good at his work. He was careful and competent, and he did not waste words or motion. Nora had relied on him without fully realizing how much until recently. She heard him moving in the barn and did not go out. There was nothing to say about the irrigation yet that had not already been said. 2 days later, she drove to the Harlan County Fruit Co-op with sample boxes packed in the bed of her truck. It was a morning that felt like early summer, trying to be spring warm and uncertain, the kind of day where you keep expecting the weather to make up its mind. The co-op sat at the edge of town, a long metal building with a loading dock and a parking lot that always smelled of cold fruit and diesel. Roy Slade ran the grading floor. He had been there for years, longer than anyone she could remember, a thick-shouldered man in his mid-50s who wore the same canvas jacket in every season and spoke with the careful deliberateness of someone who had delivered disappointing news often enough to have developed a method for it. Roy examined the samples the way he always did, unhurried, systematic, rotating the fruit in his hands, checking color and skin texture before reaching for the caliber gauge. Nora stood on the other side of the sorting table and watched. She had been through this process before. She knew what the caliber gauge was going to say before he held it up. He set it down without showing her the reading. "Flavor is excellent," he said. She waited. He shrugged just slightly. "Size is the problem, same as before." She asked him what the offer would be. He slid a printed sheet across the table. Processing grade. The number was what she had expected and still managed to feel like something falling. It was 60% less than fresh market premium. It was not enough to cover operating costs, let alone service the loan. She looked at the number for a moment and then looked at Roy. He met her eyes briefly and then looked at the sample tray, adjusting a cherry that did not need adjusting. "That's the best you can do," she said. He nodded. "Those are the standards." She thanked him and gathered the sheet and walked back toward the loading dock. The air outside was cooler than the sorting floor, and she stood in it for a moment before going to the truck. Through the window of the grading office, she could see Roy at his desk. He had turned away from the window. His phone was in his hand. She watched him dial a number and turn slightly in his chair, and the call connected, and he began to speak to someone. It lasted less than a minute. He set the phone down and turned back to his desk and opened a folder. Nora drove home. That evening, she asked Ben who else he thought might be interested in the orchard alternative buyers, anyone he had heard of in the region or beyond it. Ben was repairing a section of irrigation line at the east end of the North Block, crouched over a joint fitting with a wrench. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "The co-op is the only buyer with the infrastructure to handle this volume," he said, "unless you go smaller." She said she had been going smaller for 5 years and it was not working. He straightened up and looked at her. "Maybe it's time to think about what else the land could be." She did not answer that. She left him with the irrigation line and walked back toward the farmhouse. 3 days later, Dale Pruitt drove up the gravel drive in a black SUV that had never been on an unpaved road before that morning. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that expensive suits sometimes exaggerated, with the kind of easy confidence that came from having walked into situations like this one many times and always gotten what he wanted. He got out without cutting the engine at first, looking at the farmhouse and the hillside above it with the particular expression of a man calculating values he has already looked up. He introduced himself by name and company, Pruitt Development, as though she would recognize it. She did. He had bought 3 farms in the surrounding county over the past decade. The Hendricks placed the Old Marsh property up on the ridge and the Cowan acreage along the state road. All 3 had sold under some form of financial distress. She had heard that much from people who no longer lived on those properties. He came directly to the point, which she respected even as she disliked everything else about him. $1.2 million, he said. Cash, closes in 30 days. You walk away clear and with money left over. She asked what he intended to build. 64 luxury cabins, a resort community. This hillside is exactly what the market is looking for right now. She looked out at the orchard. The trees were in full early leaf, the hillside a dense rolling green that in July would be heavy with fruit, and in October would go to deep red and amber before the cold stripped it back. Her grandfather had chosen this hillside deliberately for the drainage, for the light exposure, for something about the soil composition that he had explained to her once when she was young, and that she had not fully understood until she started paying attention to the trees herself. She said she would think about it. He smiled in a way that suggested he had heard that before and knew what it meant. He left his cart on the porch rail and drove back down the gravel drive. Ben was standing near the barn. He had heard enough. He said nothing. Nora went inside and stood at the kitchen window. The afternoon light was long across the orchard. She thought about how Dale Pruitt had known to come. She had not told anyone outside the property about the bank's final notice. Not her sister in Lexington, not the attorney she had spoken to briefly the previous year about estate matters. No one. She went back outside. Ben was still near the barn, coiling irrigation hose. She said, "Ben, that letter from the bank." Who else knew what it said? He did not look up immediately. Then he said, "I may have mentioned the situation to someone in town. I didn't think it would travel." She looked at him for a long moment. He kept his eyes on the irrigation hose. She went back inside. That night she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, the old timber frame contracting in the cool air, and she thought about what it would mean to sell, to take the check, to pay what was owed and keep whatever remained and go back to Louisville or somewhere else entirely, and not be responsible for 1,500 trees that the market had never understood and might never understand. She thought about it with enough honesty to recognize that part of her wanted that. The part that was tired, the part that had been doing this alone for 5 years and felt it in her hands and her back and in the quality of her sleep. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to the kitchen and made coffee and did not reach for Dale Pruitt's card. That was something. The following week, she spent 3 mornings clearing the old equipment shed attached to the east end of the barn. It was something she had been meaning to do since she arrived, a concrete-floored room full of her grandfather's things, in various states of organization tools, sorted by type and hung on pegboard walls. Boxes of invoices and receipts and correspondence stacked on wooden shelving. A workbench along the back wall still holding the hand tools Walter had used for the furniture he built in the winters when the orchard work slowed. The shed smelled of oil and old paper, and the particular dust of wood that has not been disturbed for years. On the 3rd morning, she found the tin box. It was not hidden exactly. It was at the back of the bottom shelf behind a row of labeled glass jars that held bolts sorted by size, and it was locked with a small padlock, the kind that comes with a tiny key that you are very likely to lose. She found the key on a nail behind the workbench, labeled in Walter's handwriting on a piece of masking tape. He had always labeled things. Inside the box was a land survey document from 1961, folded in thirds and worn at the creases but fully legible, the original property boundary map issued by the Kentucky Department of Land Management when Walter purchased the acreage. Below that was a folder of receipts going back to the first years of the orchard, each one dated and annotated in Walter's hand. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of brown canvas, was a notebook. Brown cover cloth bound the spine, held together by a strip of electrical tape that had been added sometime in the 1980s based on its color and adhesive quality. She unwrapped it carefully and opened it to the first page. The date at the top read Spring 1963. The handwriting was her grandfather's, small and precise, and slightly slanted to the right, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to be neat about the things that mattered. She carried it inside and sat at the kitchen table and read it for 2 hours. What Walter Whitfield had recorded across 4 decades was something that no agricultural consultant had ever suggested to her and no extension office literature had ever described. He had tracked not just yield and weather conditions, but flavor. Every season, every block of the orchard. He had developed his own notation system for sweetness and acidity, and what he called nose, meaning aromatic intensity, scoring each quality on a scale from 1 to 10 with brief narrative notes. He had tracked these qualities against weather variables, rainfall temperature, fluctuation, late frost dates, summer drought stress. And across 40 years of data, a pattern emerged with unmistakable consistency. The years that were hard were the years the fruit was best. The entries that stopped her were the ones from the difficult seasons. A drought year in the early 1970s had produced fruit he rated at 9.4 for aromatic intensity. A late frost season in another decade had stunned the early bloom and reduced the crop by a third, but driven the flavor scores in the surviving fruit to levels he underlined twice. He had a notation he used in those years, a single phrase that appeared at the top of the seasonal summary stress concentration. He had written it first in quotation marks as though he was not sure if it was the right term. By the 3rd time he used it, the quotation marks were gone. At the back of the notebook, on the last page that had writing in ink that was darker than the rest, and in handwriting slightly less steady, as though written in the last years, before his hands had started to give him trouble, Walter had written a short paragraph. It said, "I have tried to find the right buyer for 30 years. Not for the land, for what the land makes. I believe it exists somewhere in the spirits industry, a distiller who understands that the flavor of a fruit is not the same as the size of a fruit. I ran out of time. I hope you didn't." Below that, in the same ink, a single line. It said, "I hope it's you, Nora." She sat with the notebook closed in her hands for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the orchard stood in the late afternoon light, the same as it always did, patient, in the way that old things are patient without any particular concern for the urgency of the people beneath them. Dottie came the next morning and Nora showed her the notebook without preamble, opening it to the last page first. Dottie sat down and read it and then turned to the beginning and read for 15 minutes without speaking. She set it down and looked at the table. "He told me he had been looking," Dottie said. "He never told me what he found in the notebook. He said there was no point talking about it until he had someone to talk to about it." Nora asked if Dottie knew he had contacted distilleries. "A winery once," Dottie said. "Maybe two. He didn't tell me details. He said they wanted something he wasn't willing to give." "Do you know what that was?" Dottie was quiet for a moment. "I think it was the name. He didn't want to sell the Whitfield name along with the fruit. He wanted whoever bought the cherries to understand that the orchard was still his, that it wasn't just raw material." Nora thought about that. She thought about Walter spending 30 years looking for someone who would buy what the trees made without claiming ownership of what they were. She thought about him giving up in 2003 or whenever the entry stopped and continuing to record the data anyway, because the recording itself had become its own kind of work, its own kind of faith. She thought about the 90 days. 2 weeks after she found the notebook, a regional food magazine published a piece about heritage fruit varieties and Appalachian farming. Nora had spoken to the journalist briefly the previous autumn, a phone interview she had mostly forgotten about. The article mentioned the Whitfield orchard in passing, 2 sentences about old variety cherries and traditional growing methods. It was not a feature. It did not have her photograph. It was the kind of coverage that normally produced nothing. She had learned not to expect much from coverage. She called the journalist on a Tuesday afternoon and asked directly whether anyone had reached out after the piece ran with interest in the orchard specifically. The journalist said one person had, a man who asked detailed questions about variety names and elevation and growing conditions, and then asked for contact information and was told she could not provide it without Nora's permission. Nora asked for his name. Miles Holt. Holt and Sons Spirits out of eastern Tennessee. She knew the name. She had seen it on a bottle at a restaurant in Louisville the previous winter, a cherry brandy that the sommelier had described in terms she had not expected to hear applied to domestic production. She had made a note of it and then lost the note somewhere in the demands of the season that followed. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with the notebook open in front of her and the journalist's note with Miles Holt's number beside it. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes. Dottie called from the back porch without coming in. "You going to make that call or just look at the paper?" Nora picked up the phone and dialed. Miles Holt answered on the second ring. His voice was direct, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned to be economical with words because he spent most of his time doing work that required his hands rather than his mouth. She introduced herself, and he said he was glad she called, and she could hear in the way he said it that he meant it without performance. He asked her 3 questions. What were the primary varieties? What was the elevation of the upper block? How old were the oldest trees? She answered all 3. He said, "I'd like to see samples. Everything you have. Can you ship this week?" She said she could. He said, "Good." And then he said something she did not expect. He said, "I knew about this orchard. Not recently, a long time ago. There's something I'd like to explain when I come." "When you come," she said. He said, "I'll be coming. I just don't know when yet." She thanked him and set the phone down on the table. She looked out the window. The orchard was dark now, the hillside a black shape against a sky that was still holding the last gray of the evening. She thought about her grandfather driving across 3 states in a borrowed truck with saplings in the bed, setting each one by hand, recording everything in a brown notebook for 40 years, and trusting that someone would eventually understand what he had been building. She thought about 62 days. The samples shipped on a Wednesday. After that, there was nothing to do but work. Nora had learned that particular discipline from the orchard itself, the understanding that certain things moved at their own pace, regardless of what you needed from them. You could not accelerate a cherry tree any more than you could accelerate the outcome of a phone call you were waiting on. You worked what was in front of you, and you let the other thing take its time. She had not always been good at that. 5 years of farming had made her better at it than she wanted to admit. She spent the following days on the North Block working the irrigation problem that Ben had been managing before the conversation about the bank letter had changed something between them. Ben still came. He still worked. But there was a quality to the silence between them now that had not been there before, a careful neutrality on his side that she recognized as the silence of a man who had done something he had not yet decided how to account for. She did not push it. She let him work and she worked beside him and she waited to see what he would do with himself. On the 12th day after the samples shipped, she drove through town for hardware supplies and saw Dale Pruitt's black SUV parked outside Roy Slade's office at the co-op. Not the loading dock, the office entrance on the side street, the one that most people who came to the co-op on business never used. She slowed without stopping. Through the glass door, she could see two figures standing near the front desk. One of them had the particular posture of a man who was used to being the one doing the explaining. She drove on. She did not tell Ben what she had seen. That evening, she stood at the workbench in the equipment shed and looked at the objects she had laid out from Walter's tin box. The 1961 survey document, the folder of receipts, the notebook. She picked up the survey and unfolded it carefully along its worn creases. The boundary lines were drawn in ink notated in the deliberate hand of a county surveyor, each corner marked with a bearing and distance measurement. The property lines were exactly as she knew them to be, the western edge running along the drainage creek, the eastern line cutting across the upper ridge, the whole of it representing what Walter had purchased and what she had inherited and what she intended to keep. She refolded it and put it back in the box with the receipts and the notebook and locked it again. She hung the key back on the nail behind the workbench and went inside. 3 weeks after the samples shipped, Miles Holt's truck came up the gravel drive on a Thursday afternoon. It was a working truck, dark blue, carrying the particular dents and surface wear of something used on actual roads in actual weather. He was taller than she had imagined from the phone, with the kind of build that came from physical labor rather than a gym, and he wore boots that had seen serious terrain. He shook her hand and looked at the hillside before he looked at the house. "That's the upper block," he said. She told him it was. He wanted to see the trees before anything else. She took him up. For the better part of 2 hours, he moved through the orchard at a pace that surprised her, not hurrying, but not pausing unnecessarily, either tasting fruit directly from the branches in a way that was deliberate rather than casual, rolling each cherry between his fingers, first examining the skin, the stem attachment, the degree of give at the shoulder of the fruit. He asked questions about rootstock, about the irrigation schedule, about the age distribution across the different blocks. She answered everything she knew and told him plainly when she did not know. At the top of the upper block where the oldest tree stood, he stopped at a tree that had to be among the first Walter had planted. Its trunk was wider than her arm span, and its canopy spread 20 feet in each direction. The bark was deeply furrowed gray-brown, scarred in places from decades of weather. The fruit on its branches was smaller than the younger trees, denser clusters dark red already at this stage of the season. He pulled a small refractometer from his jacket pocket, the kind of handheld instrument that measures sugar content in fruit juice. He pressed a cherry between his fingers and let a drop fall on the lens and held it to the light. He looked at the reading and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What's your average bricks across the upper block?" She told him she had not measured systematically. Walter's notebook had qualitative scores rather than instrument readings. He nodded slowly. "The notebook you mentioned on the phone. Can I see it?" She had brought it up with her in the inner pocket of her jacket. She handed it to him. He opened it at the beginning and stood under the old tree and read without sitting down, turning pages with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. She watched him. His expression did not change in a way that was readable, but his pace slowed as he moved deeper into the entries. And at one point, he stopped and turned back several pages to compare two entries side by side. He read for 20 minutes. Then he closed the notebook and held it for a moment without returning it. "Your grandfather was tracking stress-induced concentration," he said. 40 years of it, manually. Before there was any commercial framework for that kind of data in the domestic brandy industry. She asked him to explain what that meant in practical terms. He said when a cherry tree is under environmental stress, limited water, late frost, unusual heat variation, it does not distribute energy evenly. It concentrates. The fruit becomes smaller because the tree is conserving resources, but the sugars, the acids, and the aromatic compounds that give the fruit its character become denser. It is the opposite of what commercial grading systems reward. Grading systems reward size because size is uniform and uniform is scalable. What your grandfather was recording was the inverse. The years the co-op would have penalized most severely were the years your orchard produced fruit closest to what I need. He handed the notebook back to her. She asked, "What do you need it for?" He said, "Premium cherry brandy, single origin, the kind that has a story attached to it because the fruit itself demands a story. There are 3 distillers in this country doing what I'm doing. Two of them are sourcing fruit from Europe because they can't find domestic supply with sufficient character. I have been looking for 10 years. She said Walter spent 30 years looking for someone like you. Miles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know, my father contacted this orchard in 1997. Your grandfather refused the contract terms. She stared at him. He said my father wanted a licensing agreement that included the Whitfield name. Your grandfather said no. My father said the man was impossible to negotiate with. He walked away. He told me about it when I was starting my own operation, and I looked this orchard up and found that Walter Whitfield had died 2 years before I got around to doing anything about it. That is something I have not forgiven myself for particularly. He said it without self-pity, simply the way you state a fact that belongs in the record. She said, what are your contract terms? He said, I buy the fruit. The name stays with you. If I put the orchard on a label, it is because you agreed to it, and we negotiate that separately. The fruit is yours until I pay for it. What comes out of my stills is mine. What grows on your trees is yours. She looked at the old tree beside them. A light wind moved through the upper branches, and the fruit shifted against the leaves with a sound that she had heard 10,000 times and still found particular. She said, I need to see numbers before I agree to anything. He said, of course. I'll have something to you within the week. I need to run lab analysis on the samples first. What I'm seeing here tells me what I need to know directionally, but I don't make offers on instinct alone. He left in the late afternoon, driving back down the gravel drive without hurrying. Nora stood on the porch and watched the truck reach the county road and turn south. She thought about Miles Holt's father driving away from this same driveway in 1997 because Walter Whitfield had refused to sell his name. She thought about the 22 years between that refusal and Walter's death, the entries in the notebook continuing through all of it, the data accumulating without any particular destination. She thought about the fact that Miles had come anyway, not because he had been sent by anyone or directed by any system, but because his father had told him a story about an impossible old man with an orchard in Kentucky, and that story had stayed with him. She went inside and did not allow herself to feel certain about anything. 4 days later, on a Tuesday, she found the email. She had gone into the office at the back of the farmhouse, a small room she and Ben shared for administrative work, to look for a copy of the previous year's irrigation schedule. Ben's laptop was open on the desk, the screen still lit from recent use. She was not looking at it. She was reaching past it for the filing cabinet drawer when the screen shifted out of sleep mode, and the email client was open and visible, and the subject line of the message at the top of the sent folder read, Holt visit notes Thursday. She stood very still. She was not the kind of person who read other people's correspondence. She understood that about herself clearly, but the subject line was unmistakable, and the email was already visible on the screen she was standing directly in front of, and the decision to look further took approximately 2 seconds. The email contained a photograph of the notes she had made during Miles's visit, bullet points she had written on a legal pad and left on the office desk, and a second photograph of the first 2 pages of the lab analysis summary Miles had faxed the morning after his visit as a preliminary overview. The email was addressed to a phone number formatted as an email address, the kind used for text message forwarding. She had seen Dale Pruitt's contact card. She knew his cell number. She stepped back from the desk. She stood in the middle of the office for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she went to the barn. Ben was at the workbench, checking the teeth on a brush cutter blade. He heard her come in and looked up, and whatever he saw in her face made him set the blade down and straighten. She did not raise her voice. She said his name, and then she said that she had seen the email, and she needed him to tell her what else he had shared. He did not deny it. She had expected some form of denial, and she had been prepared for it, and its absence was somehow worse. He said that Dale Pruitt had approached him 8 months ago, that the initial contact had been small things, confirming what the property's operational costs looked like, whether the loan was current, that it had escalated over time, and that the money Pruitt had offered for the most recent information was equivalent to 18 months of his salary. He had a child starting college in the fall. He said that as though it explained something. It did not explain anything, but she understood that it was true. She said, take your keys off the hook and leave them on the table. He said her name. She said, now, Ben. He took the hook ring of property keys from his belt and set it on the workbench between them. He looked at her once more, and she held his gaze without giving him anything to work with, and then he walked out of the barn and across the gravel and got in his personal truck and drove away. She picked up the keys. They were warm from his belt. She stood in the barn holding them and listening to the sound of his truck diminishing down the county road. And when she could not hear it anymore, she put the keys in her own pocket and went back to work. She spent the rest of that day and the next 2 days doing the work of two people. She did not announce that Ben was gone. She did not call anyone to replace him immediately. She worked the North Block irrigation by herself, fixed a section of fence along the eastern boundary that had been on the list for weeks, drove to the hardware store and bought what she needed, and came back and installed it herself. At night, she was tired in a way she had not been since the first year she came back to the orchard. On the third night, she sat at the kitchen table with Dale Pruitt's business card in front of her and her phone beside it. She thought about the 18 months Miles Holt's lab analysis would take to translate into an actual contract. She thought about the 56 days remaining on the bank's notice. She thought about Ben having a child starting college and whether that made what he had done understandable or simply human. And she decided those were not the same thing, but they were not entirely separate things either. She picked up her phone. She looked at Pruitt's number already saved from when she had entered his card information. Her thumb was on the screen. She set the phone down and pulled Walter's notebook across the table and opened it to a page from the early 1980s, a summer entry where the rain had been irregular and the upper block had thrown a light crop with flavor scores her grandfather had underlined 4 times in a row. She read the entry once and then read it again. She closed the notebook. She did not pick up the phone again. Miles called on day 9 after the preliminary facts. He said he had finished the lab analysis and that he wanted to talk. Nora sat up straighter at the table. He said the preliminary numbers were good. The full analysis is better than good. Your upper block fruit has the highest natural sugar concentration I have tested in a domestic cherry in 11 years of operation. The aromatic compound density is at a level I have only seen in Marasca cherry fruit from the Dalmatian coast, which is the benchmark variety for premium European brandy production. The smaller fruit size is not a deficiency, it is the mechanism. Less water mass means more of everything else per unit of fruit. She said, "What does that mean for an offer?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, choosing words. He said, "I want to make an offer on the full harvest. Every tree, every acre. I want a multi-year agreement with a first right of refusal clause on future seasons. The price per pound for fresh delivery premium processing will be," and he said a number. She wrote it down. She looked at what she had written. She said, "Can you say that again?" He said it again, the same number. It was more than 4 times the co-op's processing grade offer. It was enough to retire the bank loan fund the operating costs for 2 full years and have something remaining. It was the kind of number that changed the character of a problem, entirely turning it from a question of survival into a question of what came next. She said, "I want to get this to a lawyer before I sign anything." He said, "Of course. Take whatever time you need." She said, "I don't have much time." He said, "I know. I'll have the contract drafted by Friday." She thanked him and set the phone down and sat at the table and did not move for several minutes. She thought about calling Dottie. She thought about going up to the orchard. She did neither. She sat in the kitchen in the afternoon quiet and let the number exist in the room with her for a while, getting used to it, the way you get used to something you have wanted for a long time and were not sure you would ever actually receive. The contract arrived Friday by email and physical mail simultaneously. She drove to an attorney in Harlan that afternoon, a woman named Patricia Briggs, who handled agricultural contracts and property law, and who read the document in 40 minutes and said it was unusual in its specificity, but favorable in every clause that mattered. She said she would sign Monday. She did not sign Monday. On Sunday night at 11:17, her phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize. She answered because farmers answer unfamiliar calls at night on the assumption that something is wrong with something. The caller identified himself as a process server from the Harlan County Courthouse. He was informing her that a civil complaint had been filed that afternoon, alleging a boundary encroachment on the western edge of the Whitfield property, totaling approximately 12 acres filed by Pruitt Development, LLC, requesting an emergency injunction preventing any commercial transaction involving the disputed acreage pending resolution of the matter. She asked how long resolution typically took. The process server said he was not in a position to advise her on that. She called Patricia Briggs at 7 the next morning. Briggs had already seen the filing. She said the injunction, if granted, would freeze all commercial activity tied to the property during litigation. That includes the Holt contract. It does not need to succeed to be effective. It only needs to last. Nora said, "How long?" Briggs said in Harlan County civil boundary disputes average 4 to 6 months to reach initial hearing. If Pruitt has a cooperative judge on the docket rotation, possibly longer. Nora said, I have 44 days. Briggs said nothing for a moment. She said, I need to find something that dissolves this before it gets to a hearing. Briggs said, if you have countervailing documentation, a prior survey, a recorded protest, anything that challenges the basis of the 1988 digital map he is using as his reference, we can file a motion to dismiss on grounds of evidentiary dispute. But I need the documentation within the week to have any timing advantage. Nora said she would call back before noon. She went to the equipment shed, she unlocked the tin box, she took out the 1961 survey document and the folder of receipts and carried them to the kitchen table and spread them out in the light. The survey was drawn by hand, the boundaries marked in the careful notations of a county employee who had stood on this ground in the spring of 1961 and measured it physically. The western boundary ran along the drainage creek line for its full extent. The 12 acres Pruitt was claiming fell entirely within those lines. She looked through the receipt folder. Invoices for irrigation equipment, fertilizer purchases, nursery stock from the early years county tax receipts going back to 1962. And then near the back, a letter on county letterhead dated 1989. It was addressed to the Harlan County Assessor's Office and signed by Walter Whitfield. And it stated in his precise, slightly slanted handwriting that he was formally contesting the remapping of his property in the county's new digital cadastral system, which he had reviewed and found to contain a coordinate translation error along the western boundary that did not reflect the ground survey of record. He had attached a copy of the 1961 survey. He had requested a formal review. The letter had been acknowledged according to a stamp at the bottom, received and filed. She sat at the table and read the letter twice. Her grandfather had known. He had known in 1989 that the digitized map was wrong, and he had written a letter that was received and filed and apparently never acted upon, and he had kept a copy of everything in a tin box in his equipment shed for the next 26 years until he died and left it to her. She called Dottie. Dottie arrived in 12 minutes, which was faster than her usual pace suggested was possible. Nora showed her the letter. Dottie read it and then looked up. I witnessed that letter, Dottie said. He asked me to sit at the table while he wrote it so there would be a witness to the date. I had forgotten about that entirely. Nora said, do you remember him ever hearing back from the county? Dottie said they sent a form letter. He called twice and was told the digital records were final and the protest had been noted. He was furious for about 3 days. Then he filed it and moved on. I think he believed it would only matter if someone ever tried to use the bad map against him. Someone was now trying to use the bad map against her. She called Patricia Briggs. Briggs listened without interrupting. Then she said a recorded county protest letter from 1989 with a contemporaneous witness combined with the original 1961 ground survey creates a strong evidentiary challenge to the basis of Pruitt's filing. This is not a guarantee of dismissal, but it is a serious problem for him. A judge reviewing this will see that the boundary dispute is predicated on a map that was contested at the time of its creation. Nora said, what do I need to do? Briggs said, I need the originals and I need a signed statement from your witness. And we should file with the State Land Management Office simultaneously, because if this map error affected your property, it likely affected others, and that becomes a different category of problem for anyone who has been relying on it. Nora looked at the 1961 survey spread on her kitchen table. She thought about Dale Pruitt's pattern, 3 farms in 10 years, all of them distressed, all of them in the western part of the county, where the 1988 remapping had occurred. She thought about the Hendricks place and the Marsh property and the Cowan acreage, all sold under pressure, all finalized through boundary disputes she had heard about secondhand without understanding what they meant. She said to Briggs, how quickly can you file? Briggs said, if I have everything by 4 o'clock, I can file with the county clerk before close of business and have the state office package ready for morning courier. She said you will have it by 2. She called Miles Holt before she left for the attorney's office. She told him what had happened straightforwardly without softening it. She said the signing would be delayed, but that she had documentation she believed would resolve the dispute on its merits. She said she needed him to hold the contract terms through the delay. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how solid is the documentation? She told him about the 1961 survey and the 1989 letter. He said, my grandfather kept every piece of paper he ever signed for 60 years. My father thought it was a character flaw. It saved our distillery twice. She said, I'll keep you informed. He said, Nora, I'm not going anywhere. She drove to Patricia Briggs's office with the tin box on the passenger seat and Dottie in the back with her signed witness statement written in the car on the drive over in handwriting considerably less steady than Walter's had been, but entirely legible and entirely certain. She left the originals with Briggs and drove to Frankfurt. She had called ahead that morning, reaching the office of the director of the Kentucky Department of Land Management after 20 minutes of navigation through a phone system that seemed designed to discourage persistence. She had spoken to an assistant and explained that she had documentation of a coordinate translation error in the 1988 cadastral digitization, affecting at minimum one property and potentially several in Harlan County, and that the error was currently being used as the basis for a civil boundary complaint. The assistant had put her on hold and come back and said the director could see her at 2:30 if she could be there. It was a 4-hour drive. She left immediately. Arthur Poole was 60 years old, with the manner of a man who had been in public land administration for 30 years and had seen most categories of dispute and found the majority of them tedious. He received her in an office that smelled of coffee and file folders and gestured her to a chair without particular warmth. She set the photocopies on his desk, the survey and the letter, and he put on reading glasses and looked at them without speaking. He called someone from the adjoining office, a younger man with a surveying background, who looked at the coordinate notations on the 1961 document and then pulled up the 1988 digital entry on his computer and sat forward in his chair. The younger man said something to Poole in a low voice. Poole looked at the screen and then at the paper document and then at Nora. He said, "Who filed the complaint against your property?" She told him. He picked up the 1961 survey again. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitfield, is this the only property in the relevant section where you have reason to believe this translation error occurred?" She said, "I have reason to believe it is not." He set the document down. He looked at the younger man and then back at her. He said, "How many?" She said she did not know the exact number, but that she was aware of 3 other properties in western Harlan County that had changed hands through boundary disputes in the past decade, all of them in the section covered by the 1988 digitization. Poole took his glasses off and looked at her across the desk with an expression that was no longer the expression of a man who found things tedious. He said, "I'm going to need you to leave those documents with us." She had brought certified copies for exactly this purpose. She placed them on his desk and stood to leave. At the door, he said, "Miss Whitfield." She turned. He said, "Your grandfather filed a protest about this in 1989. She said, "Yes." He said, "It should have been acted on." She said, "Yes, it should have." She drove back to Harlan County in the dark, 4 hours of headlights and county road and the radio on low. She passed the Hendricks farm on the state route, the old property now carrying a Pruitt development sign at the entrance announcing a coming resort project. She did not slow down. She had 31 days and a contract sitting unsigned on Patricia Briggs's desk in a state office that was now aware of something considerably larger than a single property dispute in western Kentucky. She turned up the gravel drive and sat in the truck for a moment after she cut the engine. The orchard was dark above her. She could hear the wind moving through the upper canopy, the sound of leaves in motion, patient and continuous, the same sound that had been there in the mornings and evenings of her grandfather's life and her own. She got out of the truck and went inside. She slept 4 hours and was up before dawn. The kitchen was cold in the way that late spring mornings in Harlan County could still be cold, the kind that settled into old farmhouses through the walls and the floorboards and reminded you that the season had not fully committed itself yet. She made coffee and stood at the window and watched the darkness over the orchard begin to separate into shapes. First the nearest tree trunks, then the rows. Then the hillside lifting above them into a sky that was moving from black to the particular blue-gray that preceded actual light. 31 days. Patricia Briggs called at 8:15 with the news that the motion to dismiss had been filed with the Harlan County Circuit Court and that the State Land Management Office had already been in contact requesting additional documentation related to the 1988 digitization error. Briggs said she had not expected the state to move that quickly. Nora said she had given them reason to. Briggs said the motion would be reviewed at a preliminary hearing scheduled for the following Thursday. She said the judge assigned to the docket was not someone known to be cooperative with Pruitt Development's attorneys. She said she was cautiously optimistic, which was as close to encouragement as Patricia Briggs appeared to come. Nora thanked her and went out to begin the day's work. She had hired a temporary hand through the county agricultural extension, a young man named Garrett who was studying at the community college and needed summer hours. He was 19 and knew very little about orchard work and asked good questions, which was the combination she found most workable. She showed him what she needed, and he did it without complaint, and she found herself grateful for the uncomplicated quality of his presence after the weeks she had just been through. On the third day after filing, Roy Slade came. She saw his truck from the upper block, a gray pickup she recognized from the co-op's parking lot moving slowly up the gravel drive, in the way of someone who was not certain they were going to go through with whatever they had come to do. She came down from the hill and met him in the yard. He was in his regular canvas jacket, no tie, no particular formality. He looked older than he had at the co-op, which she had not thought possible. He said, "I heard you filed a motion." She said nothing. He said, "I want you to know I didn't know about the lawsuit before he filed it." He didn't tell me he was going to do that. She said, "But you called him the day I brought samples in." He did not flinch at that. He said yes. She waited. He said, "Dale has been paying me to notify him when growers in the county are in financial distress. Information about loan status, failed co-op negotiations, that kind of thing. I've been doing it for 6 years. I knew it was wrong. I told myself it was information he could have found other ways, that I was just saving him time." She said, "And now?" He said his lawyer sent me a request last week. They want me to sign an affidavit supporting his boundary claim, stating that I have personal knowledge of encroachment activity on the western edge of your property. She said, "Do you have personal knowledge of that?" He said, "No, there is no encroachment. I've driven that boundary road since Walter Whitfield was alive. The creek line is where it always was." She said, "So they want you to lie." He said, "They want me to sign a document that is a lie, yes." A silence settled between them. A crow called from somewhere in the upper block, and the sound carried down the hillside in the morning air. She said, "Why are you here, Roy?" He took something from his jacket pocket, a folded paper printed creased from being carried. He held it out. She took it. It was a printout of an email chain. The header showed it was between Dale Pruitt's personal account and Roy Slade's co-op address. The earliest email in the chain was from 8 days after her first visit to the co-op. Pruitt had written, "Good work, keep watching that account. If Holt makes contact, let me know immediately." The language was direct and specific. It was the language of a man who did not expect his emails to end up in someone else's hands. She looked up at Roy. He said, "I've been carrying that around for 5 days trying to decide what to do with it." She said, "And now you've decided." He said, "I have a deposition scheduled with his attorneys for next Tuesday. I'm not signing anything. But I thought you should have that in case it's useful." She folded the email carefully and put it in her own jacket pocket. She said, "It's useful." He nodded. He looked at the orchard above them for a moment and then back at her. He said, "Your grandfather was a hard man to work with at the co-op. He argued about grades every season." She said he was usually right. Roy said yes. He was. He drove back down the driveway. She watched him go and then pulled out the folded email and looked at it again. Then she called Patricia Briggs. Briggs listened to the description of the email and said, "Forward it to me the moment you have a digital copy. If it means what you're describing, it does not just support our motion. It suggests coordination between Pruitt and the co-op supervisor, predating the lawsuit, which moves this from a civil property matter into potential territory for the state attorney general." Nora said, "I'll have it to you within the hour." She drove to the library in town, which had a scanner, and sent the document to Briggs, and then made 3 physical copies and put one in the tin box and one in an envelope she mailed to her sister in Lexington with a note that said, "Keep this somewhere safe and do not open it unless I ask you to." She drove back to the orchard. Garrett was working the South Block irrigation and she joined him, and they worked through the afternoon without speaking, except about the work, which was exactly what she needed. The preliminary hearing on Thursday lasted 47 minutes. She sat in the third row of the Harlan County Circuit courtroom and watched Patricia Briggs present the 1961 survey document, the 1989 protest letter, and a technical memorandum from the Kentucky Department of Land Management confirming that a coordinate translation error had been identified in the 1988 digitization of the relevant cadastral section, affecting not only the Whitfield property, but 2 additional parcels in the Western County zone. The state memorandum had arrived the previous afternoon. Briggs had incorporated it with an efficiency that Nora found genuinely impressive. Pruitt's attorney argued for a continuance to allow for additional survey review. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain, looked at the state memorandum and looked at the original 1961 survey document and then looked at Pruitt's attorney with an expression that was not hostile, but was not particularly interested in arguments she appeared to have already evaluated. She denied the continuance. She dismissed the complaint without prejudice and ordered a notation entered in the record that the boundary claim had been predicated on a survey instrument subsequently identified as containing documented errors. It was over before noon. Nora sat in the courthouse parking lot for a few minutes after Briggs walked to her own car. The morning was warm. A truck went by on the state road. A bird of some kind she did not identify moved across the sky above the courthouse roof and disappeared over the tree line. She called Miles Holt. He answered and she said it's dismissed. He said dismissed entirely. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll be there tomorrow to sign. She said, I'll have coffee ready. He said, I don't drink coffee. I should have told you that earlier. She said, I'll figure something out. She drove back to the orchard and found Dottie at the kitchen table with a plate of cornbread and an expression that meant she had already heard through the particular communication network of rural Harlan County, which moved faster than any digital system Nora had encountered. Dottie said, well. Nora sat down and took a piece of cornbread and said, well. They ate in silence for a while, which was its own kind of celebration. Miles arrived at 9 the following morning with a folder of contract documents and the same working boots and the same directness of manner that she had recognized at the first meeting as the manner of someone who did not operate with surplus motion. Patricia Briggs had reviewed the final terms the previous evening and had 2 amendments to propose, both of which Miles accepted without negotiation after reading them. The signing took 20 minutes. Briggs witnessed and left. Miles stood at the kitchen window looking up at the orchard. He said harvest should be, 6 weeks? She said 7 given the late bloom on the north block. He said, I'll have the transport arrangements confirmed by end of next week. I'm sending my own crew for the upper block. Those trees need careful handling. She said, I know how to pick cherries. He looked at her with something that was close to amusement. He said, I know you do. I'm sending my crew because I want 3 extra sets of hands, not because I think you need supervision. She said, all right. He said, there's one more thing. He opened the folder again and took out a single sheet separate from the contract. It was a design mock-up, label art for what appeared to be a bottle. She took it and looked at it. Across the top it said, Holt & Sons Spirits. Below that, in a typeface she recognized as deliberately traditional, it said, Walter's Reserve. And below that, in smaller text, Single Origin Cherry Brandy, Whitfield Orchard, Harlan County, Kentucky. She looked at the design for a long time. He said, that name was my father's mistake to lose. I don't intend to repeat it. She said, when did you design this? He said, 3 weeks ago. She said, before the lawsuit was dismissed. He said, yes. She folded the label sheet carefully and set it on the kitchen table beside the signed contract. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, Walter would have considered that premature. Miles said, probably. What do you think? She said, I think he would have been right, and I think I'm glad you did it anyway. He left mid-morning. She watched the blue truck reach the county road and turn south, and held the label sheet in her hands on the porch until the truck was out of sight. The harvest began on a Tuesday in late July, 6 weeks and 4 days after the contract signed. Miles sent a crew of 4 young people who knew their work and moved through the upper block with a speed and care that Nora watched from a distance for the first hour before she joined in. Garrett worked beside her. Dottie came on the first 2 days not to pick but to be present, which was a distinction Nora understood and did not question. The upper block came in first. The old trees Walter's original plantings gave up their fruit with the particular generosity of things that have been tending toward this moment for a long time. The clusters were dense, and the cherries were dark red, some of them nearly black at full ripeness. And when you bit into one, the flavor was immediate and complex, and not quite like anything that a grading chart could have predicted or rewarded. On the 3rd day, Roy's sleigh drove slowly past the property on the county road. He did not stop. He looked at the activity on the hillside through the truck window and drove on. She saw this from the upper block and noted it and went back to work. On the 5th day, a car she did not recognize pulled up to the gate. 2 men got out, both in their late 50s, wearing work clothes. She came down from the hill. One of them said his name was Hendricks. He said he had owned the farm 3 miles east before selling it to Pruitt Development 4 years ago. He said he had heard about the lawsuit and what had happened at the courthouse. He said we had the same boundary problem. We just didn't know what it was. We thought we'd done something wrong. She said you hadn't. He said the Attorney General's office called us last week. They said we might have grounds for a review. She said, I hope that's true. He said nothing for the moment. He looked at the orchard on the hillside, the crew moving through the rows, the loaded bins at the end of each line. He said, "Your grandfather and my father knew each other. They used to argue at the co-op meetings." She said, "I know." He said, "Mine always said Walter Whitfield was the most stubborn man in the county." She said he had a reason for most of it. Hendricks nodded. He shook her hand and drove away. She went back up the hill. The harvest took 9 days in total. The yield from the upper block alone exceeded her projected numbers by 12%, a result she attributed partly to the season and partly to the care Miles's crew had taken with the oldest trees. The north block, still recovering from the April hailstorm, came in lighter than previous years, but the fruit quality was exceptional, exactly as Walter's notebook had suggested it would be in a stress year. On the last day, she and Garrett finished the final rows of the south block by early afternoon. The last bins were loaded and the last truck pulled down the gravel drive. She stood at the edge of the orchard in the quiet that followed the departure, the particular silence of a place that has just done the thing it exists to do and is now resting. Garrett said same time next year. She said same time next year. He shook her hand with the slight formality of a 19-year-old who had decided handshakes were the appropriate thing and drove his car down the county road. She was alone. She walked up through the empty rows to the top of the upper block. The trees stood in the afternoon heat, stripped of their fruit, the branches lighter, now moving more easily in the small wind that came off the ridge. The oldest tree, the one Miles had stood under when he read the notebook, was still and large and indifferent in the best way, the way of something that had been through enough seasons to have no particular opinion about this one. She sat at the base of it, her back against the trunk, the bark rough through her shirt. The hillside fell away below her in rows down to the farmhouse, down to the county road, down to the valley. She had walked this hillside in rain and in drought, and in the particular dead cold of January, when the trees were bare and the ground was frozen and it was impossible to believe they would leaf again. She had walked it in the days after her grandfather's funeral, when she was not yet sure she was going to keep it. She had walked it at 4 in the morning after the hailstorm with a flashlight, checking the damage row by row in the dark. She pulled the notebook from her jacket and opened it to the last entry. Walter had made the paragraph about 30 years of searching in the hope it was her. She had read it many times by now. It did not get smaller with repetition. She turned past it to the blank pages that followed the remainder of the notebook, 30 or 40 pages Walter had not filled. She took a pen from her pocket. She wrote the date at the top of the first blank page. Below it, she wrote the season summary in the same format Walter had used, block by block, with the weather notes and the yield numbers and the quality observations she had made during harvest. She wrote carefully, the way you write something you intend to be read later. She did not rush it. When she had finished the season summary, she sat for a moment looking at what she had written. Then below it, in the space Walter had left for additional notes, she wrote upper block old trees. First contracted harvest, fruit exceptional. Miles Holt says it is the best domestic cherry he has tested in 11 years. I believe him. She paused. She looked out across the hillside. She wrote, I understand now why you kept recording after you stopped looking. The recording was not about finding a buyer. It was about paying attention, about knowing what the trees were doing year by year so that when it mattered, you would have the evidence. I did not understand that until this year. She stopped. The wind moved through the branches above her. The same sound had always made the same patient motion. She wrote, I will keep recording. She closed the notebook and put it back in her jacket pocket. She sat against the trunk of the old tree for a while longer and did not do anything in particular. A hawk moved on a thermal somewhere above the ridge, tilting and adjusting and working the air with the ease of something that had been doing it since long before anyone was watching. The afternoon light was long and golden across the hillside, the light that came in late summer when the sun had begun its slow southward shift and the quality of the days started to carry the first suggestion of what was coming. In October, a package arrived from Holt & Sons Spirits, a cardboard box with 3 bottles nested in packing material. She opened it at the kitchen table. The bottles were dark glass, the labels clean and simple. Walter's Reserve, Whitfield Orchard, Harlan County, Kentucky. She held one for a long time before she opened it. The brandy was amber dark, almost mahogany in the kitchen light. She poured a small amount into a glass and sat with it for a moment before she tasted it. What she tasted was the orchard. Not literally, not in any way she could have explained to someone who had not stood in those rows, but the character of the place was in it, the particular quality of fruit grown on that hillside in that soil under that light. It was there in the way that things you have known a long time are sometimes recognizable in their transformed state, unchanged in essence, changed in everything else. She called Miles. She said, I opened a bottle. He said, she said, and I understand why you drove 3 hours for the samples. He was quiet a moment. Then he said the first batch went to 23 accounts in November. We're already getting reorder inquiries. She said, I see. He said there's something else. The American Distilling Institute has a submission deadline in March. I want to enter Walter's Reserve in the brandy category. I wanted to ask you first because your grandfather's name is on the label. She said, ask me what? He said whether you're comfortable with it, whether Walter would have been. She thought about that. She thought about a man who kept records for 40 years in the belief that they would one day be understood by the right person and who refused to sell his name but never stopped hoping someone would earn it. She said, enter it. The award notification came in April. Double Gold American Distilling Institute Premium Domestic Brandy category. Miles called her the morning the results were posted. He said it in the same direct way he said most things without excess, and she received it the same way. She was in the equipment shed when he called, sorting through the previous season's irrigation parts. She held the phone and looked at the workbench where Walter had built furniture in the winters, and she let the fact of it settle. She said, I wish he could have heard that. Miles said, I think some part of him knew it was possible. That's why he kept recording. She said yes. She went back to sorting the irrigation parts. In May, a letter arrived from the offices of Pruitt Development, typed on company letterhead, addressed to Nora Whitfield, care of Patricia Briggs's address, which was also her legal address of record. The letter was from Dale Pruitt's attorney. It was polite in the careful way of letters written by people who understand they no longer have leverage. It expressed interest in acquiring the Walters Reserve brand and the associated source contract on behalf of a hospitality group Dale Pruitt was advising. It offered $4.2 million. Nora read it at the kitchen table. She folded it once and opened the drawer beside the sink, the drawer where she kept miscellaneous items, pens and rubber bands, and the small hardware that accumulates in a working kitchen. She put the letter in the drawer. She put Dale Pruitt's business card, which had been sitting on the kitchen counter since the first day he drove up the gravel drive, in the drawer on top of the letter. She closed the drawer. She poured a cup of coffee and stood at the window. The orchard was in early bloom, the timing later than last year due to a cold March, the trees covered in white flowers that moved in the morning breeze, with the particular restlessness of things that have been waiting a long time and are finally permitted to begin. By July, those flowers would be cherries. By August, they would be in boxes on their way to eastern Tennessee. By the following spring, there would be a second batch of Walters Reserve aging in barrel, and the year after that, a third, and the compound data of the orchard's history would continue to accumulate in the brown notebook on her kitchen table, season by season, in handwriting that was different from Walter's but carried the same intention. She heard Dottie at the back fence, the familiar sound of the latch on the gate. She heard her cross the yard and knock once and come in carrying something covered with a dish towel, the coffee thermos in her other hand. Dottie set things on the table. She looked at Nora. She said, you look like a person who has recently made a decision. Nora said, I got a letter from Pruitt's attorney. Dottie said, I heard something about that. The whole county has heard something about that. Nora said, I put it in a drawer. Dottie said nothing for a moment. Then she said, your grandfather once got an offer from a coal company. They wanted the mineral rights under this property. He put the letter in a drawer and never mentioned it again. Nora said, did it ever come back? Dottie said no. She sat down and poured from the thermos and lifted the dish towel from the plate. Cornbread. Nora sat across from her and took a piece, and they ate in the morning light that was coming through the window above the sink and falling across the kitchen table, and the closed drawer, and the notebook, and the signed contract in its folder, and all the evidence of a year that had tried very hard to go a different way. After a while, Nora said, I need to find someone to replace Ben. Full-time. Someone who knows irrigation systems. Dottie said, Garrett seems to know irrigation systems. Nora said, Garrett is 19. Dottie said, Walter hired your grandfather's farmhand when he was 18. Kept him for 32 years. Nora thought about that. She said, I'll talk to Garrett. She went up to the orchard in the early afternoon when the light was right, the way it came at a low angle across the hillside in the spring, and made the blossoms incandescent, each tree a column of white light against the dark background of the ridge. She walked the upper block row by row, the way she had learned to walk it, without hurrying, stopping occasionally to look at the set of the flowers, or the condition of the bark, or the way the light fell through a particular canopy. She was learning to read the trees the way her grandfather had read them, not in a single season, but cumulatively year over year, the same way you learn to read any living thing that you have decided to stay with. She stopped at the old tree near the top of the block. It was in full bloom, white flowers crowding every branch, the trunk solid and dark beneath them. She put her hand against the bark. It was rough under her palm and slightly warm from the afternoon sun, the warmth of something that had been absorbing light for decades and had learned to hold it. She thought about Walter standing at this tree in some other April 30 years ago, or 40, looking at the same flowers, in the same light, recording what he saw in the same notebook she now carried in her jacket pocket. She thought about the particular kind of faith required to keep recording something for 40 years, with no buyer, no confirmation, no evidence that anyone would ever understand what you were documenting. She thought about the difference between stubbornness and patience, which she had spent most of her life believing were the same thing, and which she now understood were entirely different. Stubbornness held on because it could not let go. Patience held on because it understood what it was holding. She took the notebook out and opened it to the current season's pages. She wrote the date and the observation upper block full bloom, late by 11 days against prior 3-year average due to cold March. Flower density high, no frost damage visible. Expect strong set if temperature holds. She wrote one more line, old tree at top of block. Appears healthy, bark holding. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket and stood in the orchard for a while longer, listening to the sound the wind made in the branches, the sound that had been there before her and would be there after, the patient, continuous sound of a living thing doing the work it was made to do.